So this month, the theme that we've been looking at is the theme of vulnerability. And according to Brene Brown, the definition of vulnerability is the emotion we experience during times of uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. And I kind of like that definition. The emotion we experience during times of uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. She goes on to write in her book, Atlas of the Heart, through our research, meaning hers, our research and training, we've asked tens of thousands of people to give us examples of vulnerability from their own lives. These are a few of the answers that directly pierce the emotion. The first date after my divorce. Talking about race with my teens. Trying to get pregnant after my second miscarriage. Apologizing to a colleague about how I spoke to him in a meeting. I don't know why this one makes me cry, but sending my son to orchestra practice, knowing that how badly he wants to make first chair, but knowing that there's a good chance he might not make the orchestra at all. Those feelings of vulnerability. Waiting for the doctor to call back. Giving and getting feedback and getting back up after striking out. And she says, while these are uncomfortable and difficult experiences, there's no evidence that they are indicators of weakness. In fact, this is one of the biggest myths of vulnerability we have found, that across cultures, most of us were raised to believe that being vulnerable is being weak. This sets up an unresolvable tension for most of us because we were also raised to be brave. There is no courage without vulnerability. Courage requires the willingness to lean into uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. She says in her most recent research in courage, leadership as the ability to embrace vulnerability emerged as the prerequisite for all the daring leadership behaviors. If we can't handle uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure in a way that aligns with our values and furthers our organizational goals, we can't lead. In a world where perfectionism, pleasing, and proving are used as armor to protect our egos and our feelings, it takes a lot of courage to show up and be all in when we can't control the outcome. It also takes discipline and self-awareness to understand what to share and with whom. And she closes the section saying, vulnerability is not oversharing. It's sharing with people who have earned the right to hear our stories and our experiences. Vulnerability is not weakness. It's our greatest measure of courage. I'm going to say that last two sentences again. It's sharing with people who have earned the right to hear our stories and our experiences. It's about learning that balance, that discernment. And so this week, this month, the last few months, the last few years, however far back you want to go, the words that I came up with to start my part of the sermon today is, we do the best that we can. And nobody can be everything to everybody. And part of being vulnerable is realizing that we're not perfect. We can be engaged, but we just can't do it all. And so my understanding of vulnerability is recognizing our own incapacity to be everything to everybody. And humility is knowing who and what we are in the larger scheme of things. Knowing, recognizing, and owning, being okay with knowing what we can and can't do. And it's okay to not be able to do it all. I love to talk about Howard Thurman, and I quote him often in my sermons, but Howard Thurman was not an activist who went out and marched. He was very much a part of the spiritual revolution that created the civil rights movement. And at times, he was criticized for not being out there on the streets. But the people who knew him knew his value because he was a safe place that the marchers went to when they needed to be renewed and inspired spiritually. Gandhi inspired a nation. But I remember taking a class about Gandhi in college and reading his autobiography and thinking to myself, this guy is kind of a jerk, at least to his wife. He wasn't the best husband. Mother Teresa opened hearts, but she wasn't on the streets marching with a blowhorn. Greta Thunberg is a voice for this new generation, but she isn't all that concerned about being liked by people who don't understand her or her advocacy for the planet. And all of these people are role models because none of us can be everything to everybody. It's just not possible. And so for the last few weeks, I think I've been feeling a little bit vulnerable. We've been asking the question in our cottage meetings and as we're moving forward, who are we as Unitarian Universalists in this valley? We can't be everything to everybody, and because of that, by setting boundaries in the last few months, we've made some people mad. And by not having better boundaries, we've also made some people mad. And by not recognizing the need for boundaries in other situations, we've made all parties involved mad. Because I think that's what it means to be moving through this thing called life. And so today, I'm grateful for people like Howard Thurman, Gandhi, Mother Teresa, Greta Thunberg, as role models for me as I'm moving through my own learning and growth and learning curves. And so if we take Brené Brown's definition, the emotion that we experience during times of uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure, I know that I've certainly felt vulnerable in the last few weeks on a number of different levels. I was deeply moved and impacted by the stories that Sandy, Cheryl, and Joanna shared a few weeks ago. And I left that service feeling somewhat powerless and helpless in the face of all the changes going on in this country. And then this week, while I was on vacation, I read an article that a county in Idaho will no longer have obstetrics care anywhere in that county because there are no obstetricians who are willing to offer prenatal care based on Idaho's new laws. And this article says, Idaho's Bonner General Health, the only hospital in Sandpoint, announced Friday afternoon that it will no longer provide obstetrical services to the city of more than 9,000 people, meaning patients will have to drive 46 miles for labor and delivery care moving forward. The release also said highly respected, talented physicians are leaving the state and recruiting replacements will be extremely difficult. Idaho has one of the most restrictive abortion bans in the country, with affirmative defenses in court for only for documented instances of rape, incest, or to save the pregnant person's life. Physicians are subject to felony charges and the revocation of their medical license for violating the statute, which the Idaho Supreme Court determined is constitutional in January. The Idaho legislature continues to introduce and pass bills that criminalize physicians for medical care nationally recognized as the standard of care, the hospital's news release said. Consequences for Idaho physicians providing the standard of care may include civil litigation and criminal prosecution, leading to jail time or fines. Dr. Amelia Huntsberger, an obstetrician gynecologist at Bonner General Health, said in an email to the state's newsroom that she will soon leave the hospital and the state because of the abortion laws, as well as the Idaho legislature's decision to not continue the state's maternal mortality review committee. What a sad state of affairs for our community, Huntsberger wrote. We have made every effort to avoid eliminating these services, said Ford Elliser, the hospital board's president, in a news release. We hope to be the exception, but our challenges are impossible to overcome now. That was an article in Friday's paper in Idaho. So if you live in certain parts of this country now, there's literally nobody there to help you be safe if you need to deliver a child. I read that headline and that article this week, and somehow I took it personally, as if I have failed. And I know that's not rational, because I'm not in charge of the whole world. But I feel like I failed. And I feel like I failed my daughter. And I feel like I've failed my fellow women. And I feel like I've failed. And then I read a headline that a man died in a jail in Alabama this week because even though he hadn't even been convicted of anything, he was awaiting trial, and they didn't give him any water for 3 days. And he died of dehydration. And once again, I kind of felt sick, and I feel like I failed. And once again, that's not rational, because we're not in charge of the whole world. And I'm not in charge of every decision that's made in every legislator, or the racism in the world, or the cruelty of our criminal justice system. But it did have me asking this week, even when I was on vacation, what is the purpose of all of it? Why even try when it feels like we're just going backwards? But then I remember we have people like Janie who are building relationship for years and years with people of another country. And I find hope and inspiration in that. And I look to people like Howard Thurman, and I find hope and inspiration at his words and his take on how to do life almost 100 years ago. Howard Thurman was the generation of some of our grandparents, but he knew how to move through the anger and the bitterness and find that still grounded center within himself. And I'm reminded of all the people who are today in the year 2023 waking up and having their own spiritual awakenings right now, and the conversations that I get to have with people about that. And then when I think about all of those things, I tell myself that it's going to be okay. Because ultimately, this is my optimistic view of humanity and ultimate reality and these 7 principles. Ultimately, I really think it is, because I think human beings are inherently good, and I think that we live in an inherently loving universe. And so I've been thinking about all of that this week, and I remember, I think we'd probably have to look back at the calendar when everything closed down, but it was almost 3 years ago exactly when COVID shut everything down. We started this whole hybrid Zoom thing very imperfectly in a circle right here with me taking my computer right here and like putting it in front of everybody's face as we talked about what we were thinking. And Dwayne Carr, one of our elders, who we lost about 2 years ago now, he said, I was at the soup kitchen and this person needed a hug. And by golly, I gave him a hug. I know I wasn't supposed to do that, but he was a real human being and he needed a hug. That was right as the pandemic was starting, when we weren't even supposed to really even look at each other or breathe near somebody. And Dwayne was saying, but by golly, this person needed a hug. To me, that is true vulnerability. And that is strength. And that is courage. There are people in this room who don't necessarily know where they're going to sleep tonight or in a week or in a month. And there are people in this room who probably own 2 or 3 homes and have places, property that they can go to be on vacation whenever they need or feel like it. And then there is probably every step on the continuum in between those 2 extremes. Where we are and who we are as human beings, one person's not right and one person's wrong, one person's not good and the other person's bad. If you think about it, and this is where sometimes when I feel overwhelmed, I put this into perspective, is there are billions of human beings on this earth right now. Billions. I'm not sure what the whole number is. And every one of those human beings, every one of us, is having our own life experience. That means that everything that we can possibly imagine that can happen in the life of a human being, in the life of humanity, is being lived and experienced in this moment in time. It means that there are human beings who are experiencing extreme wealth and people who are experiencing extreme poverty. There are people who are spiritually enlightened and open-hearted, and there are people who are living out and being cruel. We have people who are highly educated, and we have people who are extremely ignorant, because human beings are having every single experience. Billions of experiences, billions of understanding of what it means to be alive in this world. And so when I get overwhelmed, I realize that ultimately it truly is the height of arrogance for me to possibly think that I'm somehow responsible for all of it. I mean, really. Because I can't possibly be. None of us can possibly be. None of us can be responsible for everything. And in fact, we're not really responsible for anybody else. We're responsible for ourselves. We're responsible for how we're choosing to interact in this world. We're responsible for deciding whether or not we're going to be a few of those billion people with the open hearts, sending out love and compassion and kindness to the world, or are we going to get scared and feel too vulnerable and close our hearts and just live in our own little box? And maybe we do a little bit of both. Sometimes we're super open-hearted, and then there are other times when we just say, I have to go within, I have to withdraw, I'm overwhelmed, I can't do all of this. But then the question becomes, What do we do? Who do we choose to be in the middle of all of that? And then I asked myself this week also, is it okay to have some joy in the midst of it all? Is it okay to be joyful and having fun when other people are suffering? And I think if we cannot answer that question as yes, then we're in trouble. We have to be able to allow ourselves the joy and the love and the compassion to come to us in our lives, even as we acknowledge and recognize that there is hurt and there is work to be done. But if we can't allow ourselves to be joyful because for some reason we don't feel like we've deserved it because other people are suffering, then we don't have any hope for a joyful world. We're just going to have a world full of suffering, and I don't think that that's what we want. And so I want to conclude today with two very wise people. The first one is Howard Thurman, and he was asking the question, what do you do when you begin to get overwhelmed? And what do you do if you look out and say, these people aren't doing enough? And he writes, if I begin to develop contempt for the retreater, for the person who withdraws, for the thinker, for the visionary, thinking he doesn't know anything about the facts of life, what I'm saying is that it's not one or the other. But if we want to be whole human beings, we've got to breathe in and out. In and out. For when I withdraw for even 15 minutes a day, I not only have a chance to restore the waste places of my own spirit, to recapture the lost radiance of my own commitment, see my own goals clarified, bring my own life more into focus. Whether I am a religious man or not, even in terms of the straight humanist considerations, it is valid. But when I withdraw and center down in my own spirit, now this is what I believe, my friends. I believe that in that act, I become involved in the very ground of vitality in which it is possible for me to make contact with other human beings at a level that transcends all of the spoken that I can never understand through the formal discussive processes of mind. I'm going to repeat that sentence. He wrote this almost 100 years ago. I believe that in that act, I become involved in the very ground of vitality in which it is possible for me to make contact with other human beings at a level that transcends all of the spoken that I can never understand through the formal discussive processes of mind. He closes with, I think it is at this level that a great awareness, not only of the meaning of life in general, but the meaning and the dignity of human life. And then when I come out of that and go to work in my functioning, I am building my house, my world, by a blueprint that is eternal. I am building my house, my world, by a blueprint that is eternal. And to know that it is possible, or even to dare to believe that it is possible and not try it, is to run the risk of missing out on perhaps the most tremendous thing in human life. And when we bend, the words of our mouth and the meditations of our heart become acceptable to God because they are one and the same, and we are whole. And finally today, my final quote comes from a little girl in this congregation named Phoebe, who made this heart a while ago, and Maya actually texted this to me this morning. And it says, courage is doing your best. Courage is doing your best. And maybe that is all we can do. And maybe that is enough. Let us sing together. Come sing a song with me.
Come sing a song with me. Come sing a song with me. Come sing a song with me, that I might know you're mine. And I'll bring you home when hope is hard to find. And I'll bring a song of love that grows in the winter time. Come dream a dream with me. Come dream a dream with me. Come dream a dream with me, that I might know you're mine. And I'll bring you home when hope is hard to find. And I'll bring a song of love and a rose in the wind.